In our last exciting episode, I discussed the relationship between what John Locke wrote in his Second Treatise on Civil Government and the ideas that appeared in the Declaration of Independence. I presented the Declaration of Independence as an argument that aimed to prove the following conclusion, quote, that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. End quote. The previous episode then followed Locke as he argued that no person has a natural right to rule and no person has a natural duty to obey. This means that each of us is the absolute sovereign of our own lives and liberty. So how then does government get its power? The premise is stated in the Declaration of Independence as follows, quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, unquote. So then, how does this work? I'm going to continue to use an analogy that I started in the previous video. In this analogy, several hundred of us have been picked up by some tear in the time-space continuum and placed on Earth 65 million years in the past. And here we are. None of us has a natural right to rule or duty to obey any other. But we do have the right to enter into voluntary contracts. Assume that you know how to make good tools that can be used in gardening. I'd like to clear some land and start a garden, but I need something like a plow or shovel or other tools to be able to do this. If you make and maintain the tools, then I can make my garden bigger, and as payment, you can have 10% of what I harvest in a year. As sovereigns ruling over our own individual lives, we have a right to enter into deals with other sovereigns ruling over their lives. But sometimes, even well-meaning people have disputes. When the time comes to pay, I give you 10% of what I produced. But it's not the 10% that you want. I gave you apples and beans, and what you would really like to have are carrots and berries. You claim that I failed to live up to my end of the contract. I dispute that claim. Now, we could go to war over this, and naturally I would summon my friends and family to support me, and you would summon your friends and family to support you, and this could create a whole lot of unpleasantness. Here's how Locke states the case, quote, in the state of nature, there wants a known and indifferent judge with authority to determine all differences according to the established law. For everyone in that state being both judge and executioner of the law of nature, men being partial to themselves, passion and revenge are very apt to carry them too far, and with too much heat in their own cases. End quote. To avoid this unpleasantness, we agreed to submit the facts to an impartial judge and to abide by the judge's decision in the case. This is a contract that both of us freely enter into. It's like the contract to exchange tools for produce from the garden. As a result of the second contract, we're now obligated to follow whatever decision the judge gives. The judge doesn't rule because of a natural right to rule, and we don't obey because of a natural duty to obey. The judge gets her legitimate power from our consent, our agreement to present our case and abide by that decision. Now let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. Quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. End quote. We have, in our hypothetical community, selected a third-party arbitrator to resolve our disputes because of the inconveniences of trying to resolve our disputes without one. Our natural bias towards one's own side will force us into a state of war, and we don't want war, so we've hired an impartial judge. But you really don't know what the judge is going to decide until the judge decides, and that's a problem. So next, our little community agrees to appoint some number of people, let's say 5 people, to come up with a set of laws that all judges will enforce equally. And again, this is the same type of contract we had before. Now, here's a technical detail on Locke's account worth mentioning. Everybody unanimously agrees to form civil society. If somebody doesn't want to be a member of civil society, they're free to leave and return to the state of nature. Just not here. However, once we have civil society, it takes only a majority to decide what form that civil society will take. As Locke states it, quote, "For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community one body, with a power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority." End quote. In other words, forming a civil society is a two-step process. Step one, we unanimously agree to form a civil society. Anybody not wanting to be a part of civil society is free to leave. Okay, now, for those of us who stay and form a civil society, step two, the majority gets to determine what form that civil society will take. In Locke's words, quote, "It being necessary to that which is one body to move one way, it is necessary the body should move that way whether the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority, or else it is impossible it should act or continue one body." End quote. So why is it that the majority gets to determine the type of government? Well, if minorities have this right, then two or more different minorities will pull in two or more different directions, tearing the community apart. Only the will of the majority allows one community to act as one body. One last point. According to Locke, the type of government that the majority decides on can be any form of government. It need not be a democracy. It might be a monarchy. Titles might be inherited or they could be appointed. The majority is free to choose whatever form of government best secures the safety and happiness of everybody in the community, or as Locke stated, quote, "And so accordingly of these the community may make compounded and mixed forms of government as they think good." End quote. So next we have this from the Declaration of Independence, quote, "deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." End quote. Because what each of us as individuals have no right to do, we can't justly empower the government to do. I can't take the fruits of your labor without your consent, so I can't empower the government to take the fruits of your labor without your consent and to hand them to me. That would be theft. Similarly, if the members of the government were to take your property and put it in their own pockets, that would be theft too. If they spend it on the public good, that's fine. We can give them that power, but we can't give them the rights to, for all practical purposes, enslave one group of people to have them labor for the profit of some other group. Here's what Locke says on the matter, quote, "Nobody can transfer to another more power than he has in himself, and nobody has an absolute arbitrary power over himself or over any other to destroy his own life or take away the life or property of another." End quote. So what happens if a government is used to enslave or rob the people? What are you going to do about it? The Declaration of Independence says the following, quote, "that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." End quote. Or this is how Locke puts it, quote, "In these and the like cases, when the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, differing from the other by the change of persons or form or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good." End quote. Now, throwing off a government should not be done on a whim. Governments, kind of like the accused in a criminal trial, is entitled to a presumption of innocence. In the same way that one is obligated to prove that an individual presumed innocent is actually guilty, those who argue for revolution have an obligation to prove that the time has come to abolish the old government and to institute new government. This is written into the Declaration of Independence as follows, quote, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." End quote. What remains, at least within the Declaration of Independence, is to show that these facts apply to the King of England, which is what is done in the rest of the Declaration. Quote, "Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." End quote. And from this we get the conclusion of the argument. Quote, "that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do." End quote. So now we have this argument, premises and conclusions. Like any argument, it needs to be assessed. Are the premises true? And if true, are they relevant to the conclusion? One would have to study history to determine if the facts listed in the Declaration of Independence are indeed facts. However, a significant part of this is determining whether the Lockean philosophy behind the Declaration of Independence is true, or whether it contains mistakes. We should look at a couple of these issues, and that is the intention in future videos.